The afternoon sun filtered through the towering glass windows of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, casting geometric shadows across the polished marble floor. In the center of the opulent lobby, beneath a crystal chandelier that cost more than most people earned in a year, stood a man who believed he owned the world. His name was Derek Morrison, and he was the hotel manager, a position he wore like a crown. Derek was 38 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that hugged his frame just so, his blonde hair swept back with product that smelled of bergamot and arrogance. He had worked his way up through the hospitality industry, or so he told anyone who would listen, though the truth was more complicated. His uncle sat on the board of the hotel's parent company, a fact Derek conveniently omitted from his carefully crafted narrative of self-made success. What mattered to Derek was the power he held in this building, the way guests looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear, the authority he wielded over a staff of 63 people. The Grand Metropolitan was not just any hotel. It was a landmark, a beacon of luxury in the heart of downtown, where rooms started at $400 a night and went up to $5,000 for the presidential suite. The lobby alone spoke of wealth, Italian marble, Persian rugs, leather sofas that cost more than compact cars. Business executives stayed here. Celebrities checked in under false names. Politicians held fundraisers in the ballroom, and Derek Morrison presided over it all with an iron fist wrapped in a smile. But Derek had a flaw, one that ran deeper than mere professional shortcomings. He believed that money revealed character, that wealth was a measure of worth, that those who paid less deserved less. And there was something else. Something uglier that he would never admit even to himself. A prejudice that colored his vision, that made him see certain people as less than, as other, as unworthy of the same courtesy he extended to guests who looked like him. It was precisely 3:15 in the afternoon when she walked through the revolving door. Her name was Margaret Harris, though no one in the lobby knew it yet. She was 56 years old, her dark skin marked with the kind of lines that spoke of both laughter and struggle. She wore simple clothes, a navy blue cardigan over a white blouse, black slacks that had seen better days, comfortable walking shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a single worn leather bag over her shoulder. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or power. Nothing about her demeanor demanded attention. She moved quietly across the lobby, her eyes taking in everything: the fresh orchids on the concierge desk, the way the afternoon light played across the fountain in the center of the room, the young couple arguing quietly near the elevators. Margaret had learned long ago that true observation required silence, that you saw more when you made yourself small. When she reached the front desk, a young clerk named Ashley greeted her with professional warmth. Ashley was 24, new to the industry, still believing that every guest deserved the same smile, the same courtesy. She had not yet learned the unspoken rules that Derek enforced, the subtle hierarchies that determined who received genuine warmth and who received mere politeness. Margaret asked for a room. Not just any room, she specifically requested the most basic accommodation the hotel offered. Room 203, a space the staff called the dungeon among themselves. It was small, barely 200 square feet, tucked away on the second floor near the ice machine and the service elevator. The furniture was outdated, the bathroom fixtures occasionally leaked, and the view looked out onto an alley and the back wall of the building next door. The hotel charged $149 for this room, the absolute minimum, and they rarely bothered to update or properly maintain it. It existed primarily to technically meet the legal requirement that the hotel offer affordable options, a checkbox on a form, a concession to regulations. Ashley's fingers paused over the keyboard. She glanced at Margaret, then at the computer screen, clearly uncertain. It was unusual for someone to specifically request this room. Most guests didn't even know it existed. Those who ended up there did so because everything else was booked, and they always complained. Before Ashley could process the booking, Derek appeared. He had been watching from his office, monitoring the cameras that covered every angle of the lobby. He had seen Margaret enter, had made his assessments and assumptions in the span of seconds, and now he approached with that particular smile he reserved for guests he deemed beneath the hotel's standards. "Is there a problem?" His voice carried across the marble, smooth and authoritative. Ashley looked up, relieved. "No, Mr. Morrison. I'm just processing a booking for room 203. Derek's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. He turned his attention to Margaret, and in that moment, something ugly flickered across his features, something he quickly masked, but not quickly enough. He crossed his arms, a gesture that seemed casual but was actually a closing off, a physical manifestation of disdain. "Room 203, he repeated, his tone dripping with false amusement. He looked Margaret up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn shoes, her simple bag, the absence of designer labels or jewelry. "That's our most economical option." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I'm aware. I just want to make sure you understand what you're getting." Derek leaned against the counter, positioning himself between Margaret and Ashley, asserting his dominance over the transaction. "It's a very small room. No view. Quite basic amenities. Some might say it's not really up to the Grand Metropolitan standard. It will be fine." Derek's smile turned sharp. "Well, you know what they say." He paused, letting the moment stretch, aware that other guests in the lobby were now watching, that his staff had turned their attention to this exchange. "If you pay for the worst room, you get the suite." He delivered the line like a punchline, and somewhere behind the concierge desk, someone stifled a laugh. Two businessmen waiting for their colleague by the elevators exchanged glances and smirks. Even Ashley, young and still idealistic, couldn't quite hide a reflexive smile at what seemed like clever wordplay. But it wasn't wordplay. It was cruelty dressed as humor, discrimination packaged as a joke. The implication was clear that Margaret's choice revealed her poverty, her lack of sophistication, her unworthiness of anything better. The secondary implication, the one that hung in the air like smoke, was even darker. That someone like her, someone with her skin color, her lack of obvious wealth, should be grateful for whatever scraps she was thrown. Margaret stood very still. Her face revealed nothing, no anger, no hurt, no reaction at all. She had weathered worse storms than this, had faced uglier manifestations of the same disease. She simply waited, her hands resting on the counter, her expression neutral. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Derek's smile faltered slightly. He had expected a response: indignation, embarrassment, perhaps an angry departure. Instead, he got nothing, and the nothing was somehow more unsettling than any reaction would have been. "The room is $149 per night," Ashley said quietly, breaking the tension. "How many nights will you be staying?" "3," Margaret replied, her voice calm and level. Ashley processed the payment, handed over a key card, and explained the location of the elevators. Throughout the entire transaction, Derek remained nearby, his arms still crossed, his expression a mixture of amusement and contempt. He watched as Margaret took the key, thanked Ashley with genuine warmth, and turned toward the elevators. As she walked away, Derek leaned toward Ashley and spoke in a voice that carried just far enough. "Make sure housekeeping knows they don't need to waste the good amenities on that room." Ashley's smile died. She nodded, uncomfortable, and Derek walked away, satisfied that he had maintained the natural order of things, that he had put someone in their place, that the hierarchy he believed in had been reinforced. Margaret stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed, sealing her into a small space lined with mirrors. She looked at her reflection, at the woman she had become, and for just a moment, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Derek Morrison had no idea who she was. And that, she thought, was exactly the point. Room 203 was everything Derek had promised and worse. The door stuck slightly when Margaret pushed it open, the mechanism grinding against a warped frame. The smell hit her first, a mixture of industrial cleaner and mildew, the scent of a space that was cleaned irregularly and without care. The room was indeed tiny, dominated by a double bed with a headboard that had been stylish, perhaps 20 years ago. The comforter was thin and faded, printed with a geometric pattern in colors that might once have been vibrant but now looked exhausted. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, revealing chipped tile, and a toilet that ran continuously, a soft hissing that would make sleep difficult. The sink faucet dripped with a steady rhythm. The shower curtain was yellowed at the bottom, the plastic stiff and cracking. A single bath towel hung on the rack, so threadbare that light passed through it when Margaret held it up. The window looked out, as promised, onto nothing, an alley filled with dumpsters, the brick wall of the adjacent building so close that Margaret could have reached out and touched it, if the window opened more than the 4-inch safety gap allowed. The view was of rust and grime, of forgotten spaces, and accumulated neglect. But Margaret didn't complain. She set her bag on the chair, the only chair in the room, its upholstery stained and worn. She unpacked methodically a change of clothes, toiletries, a book, a notepad and pen. She moved through the space with the careful attention of someone who noticed everything, who catalogued every detail. She noted the burned-out bulb in the desk lamp, the crack in the ceiling that suggested water damage from the room above, the way the carpet near the door was permanently stained, the fibers matted and discolored, the fact that the phone on the nightstand was coated in dust, clearly unused and uncleaned for months, the absence of basic amenities that even budget hotels provided: no coffee maker, no mini fridge, no hair dryer. This was not neglect born of budget constraints. This was deliberate. This was a room maintained at the absolute minimum, a space the hotel hoped no one would choose, a deterrent wrapped in the thinnest pretense of accommodation. Around 5:30 in the evening, there was a soft knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find a young woman in a housekeeping uniform, her dark skin gleaming with perspiration, her expression a mixture of professionalism and something that looked like embarrassment. "I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am," the housekeeper said. Her name tag read Kenya. She couldn't have been more than 23 years old. "I wanted to check if you needed anything. Extra towels, maybe?" Margaret looked at Kenya for a long moment, seeing something in the younger woman's eyes, a recognition, a solidarity, an understanding of what it meant to be underestimated and overlooked. "That would be very kind, thank you." Kenya disappeared and returned moments later with an armful of towels, real towels, the thick plush kind used in the better rooms. She also brought a small basket containing shampoo, conditioner, lotion, and a wrapped bar of expensive soap. "These were left over from the supply cart," she said quietly, which both women knew was not entirely true. "They'll just go to waste if you don't use them." "Thank you, Kenya." Margaret accepted the items with genuine gratitude. "You didn't have to do this." Kenya hesitated at the door, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what happened downstairs. The way Mr. Morrison spoke to you." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It wasn't right." Margaret smiled. A real smile this time, one that softened her features and made her eyes warm. "No, it wasn't. But kindness like yours makes up for cruelty like his." Kenya nodded and left, but something had passed between the two women in acknowledgement, a moment of connection that transcended the roles they were playing in this place. That evening, Margaret left the hotel and walked the city streets. She ate dinner at a small diner 3 blocks away, ordering meatloaf and coffee, sitting in a booth by the window and watching people pass. She had forgotten what it felt like to be anonymous, to move through the world without recognition or deference. There was a freedom in it, but also a stark reminder of how differently people treated you when they thought you had nothing. She thought about Derek Morrison, about the certainty in his voice when he had mocked her, about the way the lobby had laughed along with him. She thought about Kenya, barely out of her teens, working a job that paid minimum wage and treated her as invisible, yet still finding the humanity to offer comfort to a stranger. She thought about the hotel itself, this monument to luxury that rotted from within, its gleaming surface hiding systematic rot. Margaret Harris had not always been a woman of means. She had grown up in a small town in Georgia, the daughter of a seamstress and a factory worker, in a house where money was counted in coins and groceries were carefully budgeted. She had put herself through community college working 3 jobs, had transferred to a state university on scholarship, had clawed her way into the business world when doors were locked against people who looked like her. She remembered her first job interview, how the man across the desk had looked at her with barely disguised surprise, how he had asked if she was sure she was in the right place, how he had suggested she might be more comfortable in a different kind of role. She remembered the apartments that were suddenly rented the moment she arrived to view them. The promotions she was passed over for because she didn't fit the culture. The 1,000 small cuts that bled her but never quite killed her ambition. She had persevered. She had built a career in commercial real estate, starting with small investments and growing them through savvy decisions and relentless work. She had founded her own firm 30 years ago, when such a thing was almost unheard of for a black woman. She had survived the recessions, the doubters, the men who refused to shake her hand, the clients who requested to work with someone else. Now, her firm managed a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She sat on the boards of 6 companies. She advised city councils on development projects. She employed over 100 people and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. And 3 years ago, when a struggling hotel chain was looking for investors to avoid bankruptcy, she had led a group that bought a controlling stake, seeing potential where others saw only failure. The Grand Metropolitan was part of that chain. Margaret Harris owned 18% of the company that owned the building, enough to make her voice powerful in any boardroom, enough to determine the fate of people like Derek Morrison. But she never advertised her success. She dressed simply, lived modestly, drove a 6-year-old sedan. She had learned that true power didn't need to announce itself, that real wealth whispered while poverty shouted. Tomorrow, there was scheduled to be a routine quarterly meeting at the hotel, a gathering of regional managers and corporate leadership to review performance and address concerns. Derek Morrison did not know that Margaret would be attending that meeting. He did not know that she had specifically chosen to stay at this hotel, in that terrible room, as a test. She wanted to see how the property was really run, how staff treated guests they deemed unimportant, whether the values the company claimed to hold were reflected in daily practice. So far, the hotel was failing spectacularly. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of someone pounding on a door down the hallway, to raised voices and running water in the walls. The room was cold despite the season, the heating unit under the window clanking but producing little warmth. She showered in water that fluctuated between scalding and freezing, dressed in the same simple clothes, and went downstairs for breakfast. The hotel offered a complimentary breakfast buffet for guests. It was set up in a room off the main lobby, an elegant space with floor-to-ceiling windows and tables dressed in white linen. Margaret joined the line at the buffet, noting the spread fresh pastries, fruit, made-to-order omelets, a carving station with prime rib. But when she reached for a plate, she felt a presence behind her. A young man in hotel uniform, not someone she had seen before, stepped close and spoke in a low voice. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the complimentary breakfast is only for guests in certain room categories." Margaret turned to look at him. "I'm a guest of the hotel." "Yes, but room 203 is in our economy tier." He looked uncomfortable, clearly repeating words someone else had taught him. "Economy tier guests have access to the continental breakfast in the side alcove." He gestured to a small corner where there was a card table with a coffee maker and a basket of packaged pastries, the kind you bought in bulk at warehouse stores. "Who told you to say this to me?" The young man's discomfort deepened. "It's hotel policy, ma'am. Mr. Morrison reminded us this morning." "Of course he did." Margaret nodded slowly. "I see. Thank you for explaining." She walked to the alcove, poured coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long, took a packaged Danish that was slightly stale, and sat at one of the small tables nearby. From where she sat, she could see into the main breakfast room. She watched other guests enjoy the elaborate buffet, watched staff circulate with coffee carafes and warm smiles. She watched Derek Morrison himself appear, greeting guests with handshakes and charm, playing the role of gracious host. He glanced once toward the alcove, saw Margaret sitting there, and his smile widened. He said something to the staff member nearest him, and they both laughed. Kenya appeared with a cloth to wipe down tables. When she passed Margaret's table, she murmured without looking at her. "This isn't right. This isn't how we're supposed to treat people." "How long has this policy been in place?" Margaret asked quietly. "Started about 6 months ago. Mr. Morrison calls it appropriate resource allocation." Kenya's hands worked quickly, efficiently. "But we all know what it really is." Margaret said nothing, but she made a note in her mind. 6 months. That would correlate with when Derek had been promoted to general manager, when he had been given more autonomy over hotel operations. The morning stretched on. Margaret attempted to request extra toiletries from the front desk, and was told they were unavailable for economy rooms. She asked for a wake-up call, and was told the automated system was being upgraded and wasn't available for her room category. When she inquired about using the hotel's business center to print a document, she was informed there was a fee of $25 for economy guests, while other guests used it free. Each small indignity was delivered with a smile, with apologetic words that rang hollow. And behind each interaction, Margaret sensed Derek Morrison's influence, his philosophy that those who paid less deserved less, that certain guests could be treated as second-class citizens. But Margaret endured it all with quiet grace. She smiled, she thanked people, she never raised her voice, or made a scene. She simply observed, catalogued, and waited. At precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, Margaret changed clothes. From her bag, she pulled a tailored black suit, expensive and elegant. She put on a silk blouse, pearl earrings, and heels that added 3 inches to her height. She applied minimal makeup, pulled her hair back in a sophisticated twist, and looked at herself in the mirror. The transformation was complete. She no longer looked like someone who could only afford room 203. She looked like exactly who she was, a woman of power and means. The quarterly meeting was being held in the hotel's executive conference room on the 3rd floor, a space Margaret had toured 2 years ago when the company first acquired the property. She took the elevator up and walked through doors, where a security guard checked her identification against a list. Her name was there, of course. Margaret Harris, board member, Strategic Investment Partners. The conference room was already filling with people. Regional managers, corporate executives, the hotel's senior staff. They mingled over coffee and pastries, the good kind, discussing performance metrics and market trends. Margaret entered quietly, took a seat near the end of the long mahogany table, and waited. Derek Morrison was there, dressed in his best suit, laughing loudly at someone's joke. He was holding court near the windows, surrounded by subordinates and peers, clearly in his element. This was his stage, his moment to shine. He had prepared a presentation on the hotel's improved profitability under his leadership, had charts and graphs ready to showcase his success. He had not yet noticed Margaret. The meeting was called to order by Robert Chen, the regional vice president, a serious man in his 50s who ran these quarterly reviews with military precision. People found their seats. Derek positioned himself near the front, his laptop connected to the projector, ready to present. Robert began with standard business, reviewing overall company performance, discussing market challenges, introducing new initiatives. Then he turned to hotel-specific reports. Let's start with the Grand Metropolitan. Derek, why don't you walk us through your numbers? Derek stood, confident and smiling. He clicked through his presentation. Occupancy rates up 8%, average daily rate improved, guest satisfaction scores holding steady. Operational costs down 12%. He spoke about efficiency improvements, about strategic amenity allocation, about right-sizing services to match guest tiers. It was all code. Margaret recognized it immediately. Efficiency improvements meant cutting corners. Strategic amenity allocation meant discriminatory service. Right-sizing services meant treating some guests as less deserving than others. Derek concluded his presentation to polite applause. He sat down, pleased with himself, and that's when his eyes finally scanned the room properly. They moved past corporate faces he knew, past managers from other properties, and then they landed on Margaret. The blood drained from his face. He blinked, as if trying to clear a vision. But Margaret remained exactly where she was, sitting calmly at the conference table, a notebook open in front of her, a pen in her hand. She was looking directly at him, her expression neutral and professional. Derek's mouth opened slightly. He looked at the door, as if expecting someone to tell him this was a mistake, that the woman from room 203 couldn't possibly be in this meeting, couldn't possibly belong here. But no one said anything. Because Margaret did belong here. She belonged here more than Derek himself did. Robert Chen continued with the agenda, unaware of Derek's sudden distress. Now, before we move on to the next property, I want to address some concerns that have been brought to corporate's attention. He glanced at his notes. We've received several complaints about inconsistent service standards at the Grand Metropolitan. Comments about differential treatment based on room category, about staff making guests feel unwelcome, about a culture that seems to contradict our stated company values. Derek found his voice, though it came out strained. I'm not aware of any significant complaints. Our guest satisfaction scores. Your scores are averaged, Robert interrupted, his tone cool. Which can hide pockets of serious dissatisfaction. And frankly, we're concerned about the methodology. Are all guests being surveyed equally, or are we selectively collecting feedback from our premium clientele? The room had gone very quiet. Other managers were watching Derek now, sensing blood in the water. Corporate meetings rarely took this confrontational tone unless something was seriously wrong. Margaret raised her hand slightly. If I may, Robert. Robert nodded. Of course, Margaret. Derek's head swiveled so fast, it was almost comical. Margaret. Robert had called her Margaret. The familiarity implied relationship, history, status. Derek was beginning to understand that he had made a catastrophic error, though the full scope of it was still dawning on him. I'd like to share an observation, Margaret began, her voice measured and clear. She stood, commanding attention without effort. For the past 24 hours, I've been staying at this hotel as a guest. I specifically chose to book the most economical room available, room 203, because I wanted to experience firsthand how the property treats guests across all price points. Derek had gone gray. He knew what was coming, could feel the walls closing in, but he was powerless to stop it. Margaret continued. Upon my arrival, the general manager made a point of mocking my choice of accommodation. In front of staff and other guests, he made a joke that implied I was unworthy of quality service. He said, and I quote, "If you pay for the worst room, you get the suite." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. I assume he thought he was being clever. Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. One woman, the director of human resources, was writing rapidly in her notebook. The room itself was barely habitable, poorly maintained, dirty, with broken fixtures and insufficient amenities. I might have dismissed this as simple neglect, but subsequent interactions revealed a pattern. I was excluded from the hotel's breakfast buffet and directed to an inferior alternative. I was denied basic services that other guests received as standard. I was charged fees that other guests were not charged. And throughout all of this, I watched the general manager create and enforce a culture of discrimination. One that divided guests into worthy and unworthy categories. Margaret's voice remained calm, but everyone in the room could hear the steel underneath. This is not about my personal comfort. I could have revealed my identity at any time and received different treatment. But that's precisely the point. Quality service, dignity, and respect should not depend on who you are or what you're perceived to be worth. They should be universal. Robert Chen's expression had gone from serious to grave. Derek, do you have a response to these allegations? Derek stood shakily. His mind was racing, searching for explanations, for excuses, for any way to minimize the damage. I didn't know who she was. I didn't recognize. He stopped, realizing too late how those words sounded. How they confirmed everything Margaret had said. So your defense is that you would have treated her differently if you'd known she was important? The question came from a woman named Lisa Park, the company's chief operating officer, her tone sharp as a blade. That you only extend courtesy and respect to people you perceive as powerful or wealthy? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Lisa pressed. Explain to us why you thought it was appropriate to mock a guest. To laugh at her choice of accommodation. To create service policies that explicitly discriminate based on how much someone pays. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. There was no good answer because there was no defense. Every word he spoke would only make things worse. Margaret spoke again. I'd like to note that not all staff participated in this culture. A young housekeeper named Kenya went out of her way to provide me with basic amenities that should have been standard. She did so quietly, almost apologetically, as if showing basic human kindness was an act of rebellion. That tells you everything you need to know about the environment that's been created here. Robert Chen made a note. We'll want to speak with Kenya and thank her for upholding our values. And we'll need to interview other staff members to understand the full scope of the problem. He turned to Derek. You're suspended effective immediately. Human Resources will conduct a full investigation, and you'll be notified of the outcome. In the meantime, you need to leave the premises. You can't be serious, Derek started. I'm completely serious, Robert said. Your behavior has exposed this company to significant liability, damaged our reputation, and betrayed the trust we placed in you. Whether this suspension becomes a termination will depend on the investigation, but I can tell you right now, I've already heard enough to form a strong opinion. Derek looked around the room, searching for allies, for anyone who might defend him. But he found only cold stares and averted eyes. The same people who had laughed at his joke yesterday, who had enabled his behavior, who had benefited from his management style, now wanted nothing to do with him. The tide had turned, and Derek Morrison was drowning. He gathered his laptop with shaking hands and walked toward the door. As he passed Margaret, he paused for just a moment, opened his mouth, as if to say something, an apology, a plea, an explanation, but no words came. What could he possibly say? He had shown exactly who he was, had revealed his prejudices and his cruelty, and now he would face the consequences. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the ceiling of a tomb. The meeting continued for another hour, focused now on immediate remediation steps. Kenya was brought up from housekeeping and thanked officially for her integrity, then offered a position in the training department with a substantial raise. Other staff members were interviewed. A pattern emerged of fear and complicity, of good people staying silent because they needed their jobs, of a culture that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. By the time the meeting concluded, sweeping changes had been mandated. The Grand Metropolitan would undergo a complete service review. All differential policies based on room category would be eliminated. Staff would receive comprehensive training on dignity and inclusion. And Derek Morrison would never work in hospitality again. The investigation was a formality, but the outcome was already certain. That evening, Margaret returned to room 203 one last time. She gathered her few belongings, but before leaving, she wrote a note on hotel stationery and left it on the desk with a generous tip. The note was addressed to Kenya and the housekeeping staff, thanking them for their humanity in a place that had tried to strip it away. As she walked through the lobby with her bag, she noticed the change already. The staff member who had excluded her from breakfast that morning now held the door open, his expression apologetic. The front desk clerk who had made excuses about unavailable amenities looked away, ashamed. The opulent space felt different now, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of place it would become. Margaret paused near the fountain in the center of the lobby. She had spent 24 hours being treated as less than, being dismissed and mocked and marginalized, all because of assumptions made from her appearance and her budget. It had been exhausting and infuriating, but also necessary. She had needed to see the truth beneath the polish, needed to experience what countless others experienced every day, needed to understand exactly what needed to change. Kenya found her there. The young woman was out of her housekeeping uniform now, wearing jeans and a jacket. Her shift ended for the day. Miss Harris, she said tentatively. I just heard what happened. They told me everything. You did the right thing, Margaret said. Never forget that. In a place that rewards cruelty, kindness is an act of courage. Kenya's eyes filled with tears. I've been working here for 2 years, and I thought that's just how things were, how they had to be. I thought I was nobody, that my voice didn't matter. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. The way you treat people matters. Margaret placed a hand on Kenya's shoulder. And that matters more than any title, any salary, any position of power. They stood together for a moment, these two black women in a space that had tried to diminish them both, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection, a promise that things could be different. Margaret left the Grand Metropolitan as the sun set, painting the city in shades of orange and gold. She had spent her entire adult life fighting battles like this, challenging systems that tried to determine worth based on skin color and bank accounts, refusing to accept that some people deserved less because of who they were or where they came from. She was tired, sometimes, of always having to be strong, of always having to prove her worth, of always being the one to call out injustice. But she also knew that she had the power to create change, and with power came responsibility. She thought about Derek Morrison, whose career was over, whose certainty and privilege had crumbled in the space of an afternoon. She didn't take pleasure in his downfall, but she didn't regret it either. Some lessons were hard, and some consequences were earned. The Grand Metropolitan would change. It had to. The company would ensure it, would send consultants and observers, would implement new policies and track compliance. But the real change would come from people like Kenya, from staff members who now understood they could speak up, who had seen that dignity and respect weren't privileges to be rationed but rights to be protected. Margaret thought about all the hotels and businesses where this same story played out every day, where people were judged by their appearance, where service varied based on prejudice, where humans were sorted into categories of worthy and unworthy. She thought about the exhausting work of dismantling these systems, piece by piece, one confrontation at a time. But she also thought about hope, about the fact that change was possible, that injustice didn't have to be accepted, that every act of courage added up. Kenya had shown courage by providing those towels. The staff members who admitted to investigators what they'd witnessed had shown courage. Even the people in that conference room who had listened and acted, they were part of the solution. As Margaret walked down the street, blending back into the anonymity of the city, she carried with her the memory of Derek Morrison's face when he realized his mistake. Not because she wanted to gloat, but because she wanted to remember that moment when prejudice confronted consequence, when assumption met reality, when power shifted. She had been underestimated her entire life. People had looked at her and seen nothing, no potential, no intelligence, no worth. They had tried to keep her small, to put her in boxes, to determine her value based on their limited vision. And she had spent decades proving them wrong, not out of ego but out of necessity, not for herself alone but for everyone who came after her. The story of Room 203 would ripple outward. Staff would tell it to other staff. Guests would hear whispers. The industry would take notice. And maybe, just maybe, some other manager in some other hotel would think twice before mocking a guest, before creating policies that divided people into categories, before forgetting that dignity is not a luxury to be rationed but a right to be honored. Margaret Harris had learned many things in her 56 years, but the most important was this. You discover who people really are by watching how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Derek Morrison had revealed his character in that moment in the lobby, when he thought he was speaking to someone powerless, someone who didn't matter. He had shown his true face, and it was ugly. But Kenya had also revealed her character, in the quiet moment when she brought those towels, when she offered comfort to someone she thought had no power to reward her. Kenya had shown her true face too, and it was beautiful. In the end, that was the measure of humanity, not wealth or position or authority, but the small choices made when no one was watching, the kindnesses extended without expectation of return, the courage to treat every person as worthy of respect. That was the standard Margaret held herself to, the standard she demanded of the companies she led, the standard she hoped would spread through example and consequence. The city lights came on as dusk deepened into evening. Margaret Harris walked on, just another person on the street, anonymous and unnoticed. Somewhere behind her, the Grand Metropolitan stood tall against the darkening sky, a monument to luxury that had forgotten the most basic human values. But it would remember now. She had made certain of that. And tomorrow, in that hotel and in others like it, staff would gather and whisper about what had happened. They would remember that appearances can deceive. That power takes many forms. That every guest deserves dignity regardless of how much they pay or what they look like. They would remember the woman in room 203, and they would think twice before making assumptions. That was Margaret's legacy, not her wealth, or her titles, or her business success, but the incremental changes she forced into being, the small shifts in behavior that added up to systemic transformation, the reminder that justice was worth fighting for even when the fight was exhausting. She had been underestimated, dismissed, mocked, and mistreated. And she had turned that experience into accountability, into change, into a lesson that would echo far beyond one hotel and one afternoon. Because that was what you did when you had power. You used it not to elevate yourself, but to create conditions where everyone could stand with dignity. The worst room in the hotel had become the stage for the most important lesson. And Derek Morrison's cruel joke had backfired spectacularly, teaching a truth he never intended. That respect and dignity should never be contingent on perceived worth, that true character reveals itself in how we treat those we believe to be beneath us, and that assumptions based on appearance and prejudice can exact a heavy price. Margaret disappeared into the evening crowd, leaving behind a hotel forever changed, a staff forever enlightened, and a manager forever humbled. The Grand Metropolitan would survive this scandal, would emerge better for it. And somewhere in America, in another hotel lobby, another guest would be treated with dignity because of what happened here, because the ripples of change traveled far, because justice, however delayed, however hard won, was always worth the fight.